For his fourth decade of recording music, Neil Young continues to follow his muse. He starts the decade with long guitar jams and distortion. Then he decides to go back to the middle of the road. Then he surprises everybody by recording with Pearl Jam. And then he reunites Crazy Horse. And of course, he continues to tour. Now, does this sound like a man who's slowing down? No. It sounds like one of my favorite artists, Neil Young. So let's take a look at what Neil does in the 1990s. Let's drop the needle. Neil starts the 1990s by recording his 18th studio album and the 6th album that he's made with Crazy Horse. It's recorded up at his ranch, and Neil has a habit of recording everything. The practices, the outtakes, the mistakes, whatever. And sometimes that stuff actually ends up on the record. And that's what happened with this album called Ragged Glory. Now, Neil had decided that nobody was jamming anymore. There were no long guitar jams. Songs were getting short and sweet and all that. So he decided he and Crazy Horse would change that with this album. The album contains 2 songs that are over 10 minutes in length, Love to Burn and Love and Only Love. Then there's one song at 8.5 minutes, Over and Over. One song at over 7 minutes, Country Home. Then there's the classic, Fucking Up. Oh, and Neil includes one of those first takes on their version of that old chestnut, Farmer John. The album sells. It hits number 31 in the US, 15 in the UK. Young then decides to go on tour with Crazy Horse. And this tour actually results in a double album and a single album. And at first, they're put out together as a triple album called Arc Weld. But then they're separated. The double album is called Weld, and it is a terrific album. You get killer versions of Crime in the City, Cinnamon Girl, Cortez the Killer, Powderfinger, and a cover of Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind. Then Arc is released as a solo album, and it's 35 minutes of guitar feedback, noises, and sonic sounds. And both of these albums, Arc and Weld, are very, very loud. And Neil has said that his hearing was permanently damaged by making these records. In fact, Neil's hearing was so damaged that he decides for his next album, he's going to tone it down. He's going to go for a softer, mellower sound, similar to what he had in Harvest. And that's what the album Harvest Moon is. Now, the band that he recruits are called the Stray Gators, and they also include James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, and Nicolette Larson on vocals, all of which played on the original Harvest album. The album opens with the great Unknown Legend, which was inspired by Neil's wife Peggy. Then there's From Hank to Hendrix, The Lovely Harvest Moon, Such a Woman, Dreamin' Man, and Natural Beauty. I like this album a lot. It reached number 16 in the US and number 9 in the UK. By 1993, Neil's feud with MTV is long forgotten, and MTV had a series which was called Unplugged, where they would get artists to come in and play acoustic versions of their songs. And so Neil does that, and it's a great concert. And of course, there's an album that comes out from that. Neil plays old favorites like The Old Laughing Lady, Mr. Soul, The Needle and the Damage Done, Helpless, Transformer Man, and then newer ones like Unknown Legend, Harvest Moon, and From Hank to Hendrix. The album reached 23 in the US and number 4 in the UK. Later that year, Neil goes out on tour, and his opening act is Pearl Jam. And Pearl Jam joins Neil on stage for a version of Rocking in the Free World. It's sort of grunge meeting Neil Young, who later gets called the godfather of grunge. Next up in 1994 is an album that Neil records called Sleep with Angels. And it's a dark album because it was inspired by Kurt Cobain's suicide. In his suicide note, Cobain quotes Neil Young. It says, "It's better to burn out than fade away." Well, this really affected Neil, and he pours his emotions into this album. I like the record. There's the opener, My Heart, Prime of Life, The Great Sleeps with Angels, Train of Love, Piece of Crap, and A Dream That Can Last. This was a hit. It got to number 9 in the US and 2 in the UK. In 1995, Neil reaches out to Pearl Jam and asks them to record an album with him. The album is called Mirror Ball, and the album was recorded in just 4 days. Neil would come into the studio with a bunch of songs that he had written each day. Pearl Jam and he would do like maybe 5 takes on it, and that was it. The record was done. Some of the great tracks are the opening track, Song X, Act of Love, Downtown, Peace and Love, Throw Your Hatred Down, and the long, at almost 9 minutes, Scenery. The album's another hit for Neil, number 5 in the US and 4 in the UK, and then later that year, Neil Young is inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by nobody else than Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. The next album Neil releases is a soundtrack album for a film called Dead Man, and it's instrumental, and Neil actually composed it and recorded it while watching the movie. Then in 1996, Neil recruits again Crazy Horse and decides they'll make another album, and it's going to be their first album that they will record without Neil's long friend producer David Briggs. And Neil has said he wasn't sure that they could make the album, but he wanted to try because he wanted to have one under his belt without Briggs. The album is called Broken Arrow. Tracks include Big Time, Loose Change, Changing Highways, This Town, and one of the songs Neil played with his first band, The Squire, all those years ago up in Canada, Baby, What Do You Want Me to Do? The album reached 31 in the US and 17 in the UK. Then Neil and Crazy Horse go out on tour, and the tour is filmed, and the film is called The Year of the Horse, and a live album accompanies the film. Tracks include When You Dance, I Can Really Love, Mr. Soul, Human Highway, Slip Away, and Danger Bird. It reaches 57 in the US and 36 in the UK. And like he did at the end of the 80s, for the end of the 90s, Neil Young once again joins his old friends Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young to record another album called Looking Forward. Neil wrote 4 songs for the album. The title, Looking Forward, Slowpoke, Out of Control, and Queen of Them All. The album hit 26 in the US, but could only reach 54 in the UK. The band went out to support the album, and because this was right around that period where we were changing into another century and people were worried about computers crashing and all that, they decided to call the tour CSNNY 2K. And so, as Neil had done in the last decade, he closes out this decade with his friends. Now, this is the point in the episode where I would refer you to Spotify, but as I'm sure you know by now, Neil Young's songs are not on Spotify. So instead, I'm going to refer you to his website, neilyoungarchives.com, for everything that you want to know about Neil and his music. As he did in the 1980s, in the 1990s, Neil Young releases 11 new albums. Quite a busy man. And as we move to his 5th decade in the next episode, I'm sure it's going to be interesting. After all, it's Neil Young. Thanks for watching. Keep it rockin'.
If you like this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.